coming up for our 4th anniversary here at Barnsdale, and the garden's now beginning to get established. It's a nice stage, I think, because everything is beginning now to grow up so that you can't see the whole of the garden all at once. But of course, inevitably, that means that there are areas here and there that are beginning to get overcrowded. So I'm going round now with my notebook, just jotting down things that have got to be moved this autumn. I don't like to see too much bare soil in my borders, so what I did here was to plant hardy herbaceous plants fairly close to shrubs, just to fill up the space while the shrubs were growing. But of course, as soon as they start to impede the growth of the shrubs and to spoil their shape, then something's got to give. And there's a perfect example here. These Michaelmas daisies are now growing into this cotinus, and that will eventually spoil the shape. So the Michaelmas daisies are the ones that have got to go, because herbaceous plants actually thrive on being moved, whereas shrubs do like to get their feet under the table and keep them there. So I shall make a note of those Michaelmas daisies and move them in the spring, because that's when they like to be shifted. But there are plenty of others that like to be moved now. So earlier on I went round with John Kelly, and together we've decided which ones need to be shifted, and he's volunteered to give me a hand lifting them and also splitting them to provide lots more new plants. Though I've got a funny feeling he had an ulterior motive volunteering for that job, so I've also been pointing out to him some of my more notable planting mistakes, so he's going to have quite a bit of digging to do today. Well, I've also filled up some spaces with half-hardy annuals. They give quite a zest to the border during the summer, but of course now they're beginning to go over, and certainly as soon as the first frost comes along, they're going to be clobbered. So Anne Swithenbank's going to give me a hand there, pulling those out and replacing them with the hardy spring bedding, which will give me a good show early on in the year. Well, this is the last programme in this series, and we won't be back with you until the first week in January. But of course, there's still plenty to be getting on with during the autumn and the winter. I'm going to be kicking off the autumn planting because I still believe, containers or no containers, that autumn is the best time for planting, certainly trees and shrubs. Looking back on this last season, it's certainly been a funny one, hasn't it? It started off really promising, and then all of a sudden it turned wet and cold and it never really recovered. Mind you, it's been a good year, I think, for growth in the ornamental borders, but in the vegetable garden, my goodness, there have been some problems. How about this for unmitigated disaster? These are all onions that have been raised from sets, and almost every one of them has run to seed. And if my post bag is anything to go by, then there are gardeners all over the country having exactly the same problem. And I put it mainly down to the weather. The trouble is that if onion sets have a cold spell after planting, they tend to run to seed. And it doesn't need to be that cold either, only about 43 degrees Fahrenheit. So what can we do about it? Well, the first thing you can do is to choose the right variety. The Stuttgarter and Styron varieties are less prone than the Rheinsberger varieties. But more important than that is to choose the right size of set. Now, if you look at an onion set like that, it looks wonderful, doesn't it? And you go into a shop and you'd be very tempted to buy that. It will certainly give you a bigger yield too. Much bigger bulbs and therefore a bigger overall yield. The trouble is that sets of that size are much more prone to bolting than sets of that size, and that's the one you ought to go for. I can tell you that the commercial growers always go for those because they don't want to risk these big ones bolting, even if they're going to get a bigger crop from them. There are some seedsmen who are offering heat-treated sets, and research has shown that heat-treated sets are certainly less prone to bolting. Having said that, this row here is Showmaster. They were heat-treated, and there are quite a few there that have run to seed this year. Not as many as the others, I must admit. Now, I think that the other important thing is to try and avoid that cold period. Now, of course, we can't change the weather, but one of the things that books often recommend is planting onion sets, say, in February. I think that's much too early, and the end of March is perfectly okay. If you want to get an early start, start them off in the greenhouse, in pots or proper packs, or alternatively, do what we've recommended for a long time, and that is cover the area that you're going to plant them in with a bit of polythene to warm the soil up. About the end of March, take the polythene off, put your onion sets out, and then cover them up with a bit of this woven polypropylene material to keep them warm until the weather warms up a little bit, and that way you could well avoid it. Mind you, I haven't done that badly with onions this year. I'm quite pleased with this crop here. These are seed raised. They were sown in the greenhouse in February. This is a variety called High Grow, and they were multiple sown. That is sowing 6 or 8 seeds in a block and planting them out in a little clump without thinning, and you can see now that they just jostle each other out of the way and produce perfectly good sized, kitchen sized bulbs. Good way of growing them, that, but not quite as good as my very best onion here. How about that one for size? I'm quite proud of that. Well, no, I'm joking, I must admit. This one was grown actually by a chap called Ivan Mace in the Rhondda Valley, and it is a world record breaker. It's just won him £2,000 in the Kelsay Onion Festival. This is a variety called the Kelsay, and in doing so, it smashed the world record. Previously, it was, what, £7, 11 3/4 ounces. This one weighs a magnificent £8, 13.5 ounces. Not bad, eh?
Geoff sent me down here to sort out what he says are mistakes. Well, Geoff doesn't make a lot of mistakes. This isn't one, really. This is a Far Eastern member of the daisy family. It's not a bad plant at all. It has nice feathery yellow flowers. They've gone over now, but they decorate the later part of the summer. It's okay. The only thing is it does spread quite rampantly. Now, with some plants, that's a disaster. But with this one, there's no reason why you shouldn't grow the plant, because if it does get a bit above itself, you just pull bits out and just get rid of them and leave what you want. Now, there's only one thing. By pulling that out, I've exposed this rose to the wind. And if the wind gets hold of this, and actually the winds here are pretty strong, what's going to happen is that this movement will be translated right down to just above soil level. Where the plant joins the soil, there will be also a certain amount of circular motion. And what's going to happen is that you'll get a hole at the bottom of the rose which will fill up with water, and it's the last thing you want. Well, the answer to that is to reduce some of this sail area and make the wind have less effect. So you can cut it back by at least a third and make a sloping cut, but there's no need to be very accurate about outward pointing buds and that sort of thing at this stage, because we are going to have some frosts and you'll probably get a little bit of dieback, but you've pruned at a point above which you'd normally prune. So next March you can go in and do the job accurately and properly. Just now that's going to, and I think I might as well take a bit off there because there's also quite a lot of movement. Now that really isn't going to shift very much. It might be a good idea just at this stage as well, just to firm the soil around the base of the rose, just to give it a good anchorage. Now, I said that that wasn't really a mistake, but I'm afraid this is. This actually is a good plant as well, but it's a plant in the wrong place. This is Rubus tricolour. Now, if you've got a big garden and you've got an area of dry shade under trees, it's always a problem. This is a plant which will solve it. It'll grow absolutely anywhere. Nice glossy leaves and flowers about, I suppose 1.5 inches across, white, and also red berries. But here, it's a little bit of a disaster. It's invaded this conifer, it's invading the phloxes, and there's only one thing to do, and Geoff agrees with me. All we've got to do is just get on with it and start pulling it out.
We've been lucky here at Barnsdale because we haven't had any frost yet, but I'm sure we will soon, so all these summer flowering bulbs will have to come inside for the winter, be stored in a frost-free place. The eucomias here are quite tender. They've done very well, but unless you've got a very sheltered border, they will need some frost protection. So I'd lift those, pop them up into some potting compost, give them one water, and then just let them dry out for the rest of the winter. They can be put back outside the following spring. And with these gladioli, once they've started going brown and yellow, you can dig them up out of the ground and store them. There's the tuber. Leave them separate for about a week just so that they can dry out a little bit, and then store them either in string bags or boxes in a frost-free place. And a little later on, when they've dried out, you can take off the old tuber on the bottom. You see that? You can see the new tuber and the old one. The old one will pull off when it's dry, and you can also take off any of the papery bits on the outside and store those. I'm afraid they're not always guaranteed to flower again the following year, so if you want gladioli for a very important patch of the garden, I'd buy some new ones and put the old ones out in the allotment for cut flower or something. With dahlias, it's important to let them get blackened by the frost and leave them for about a week before you lift them. The reason for this is because towards the end of the season, during the short days, the tubers do a lot of building up for the following year. So it's quite important not to lift them yet, but to wait until the frost has caught them. And then when you have got them out, if they've got some stems still on them, you should leave them upside down for about a week and just let the sap run out of the stems so it doesn't rot the tuber. And then they can be put into boxes with some compost just covering the roots, not right over the crown. Just some peat or some old dryish compost, and just stored like that for the rest of the winter in a frost-free place. Perhaps just check them once or twice to make sure they're not going mouldy. Now, we've taken out the bedding plants from this bed because although they hadn't completely finished flowering, they were as good as finished. And we want to get the spring bedding in, and if you've got time to do it, you really want to get cracking. And although Geoff grows all his own stuff at Barnsdale, we thought it'd be quite useful to go out and see what the local garden centres had to offer. They had some nice Canterbury bells, which they were selling at 30p for a pot. And they're quite tall plants. They grow between 1 and 2 feet tall, and they spread quite a lot as well. So you want to give them about a foot apart so they can develop properly. Put them towards the middle or back of the border as they're quite tall. And I want to put some forget-me-nots, some myosotis around the front here. These were selling at £2 for 24 plants. Now, I like to put some tulips in between the myosotis. These are golden appledoorn, and I think the blue and the gold will look very well together. They want to go, I suppose, about 6 inches apart. Plant the plants in and then just put the tulips in amongst them. And the tulips, of course, want to be planted about 6 inches deep and just space them out so there's a nice clump of them there. Universal pansies are very reliable. These were 30p locally, but I think you might find they're a little bit more expensive, especially in towns. You might find them even going up to about 60p. But of course, the nice thing about these is that, that's a bit of a moth-eared one. The nice thing about them is that in the winter, if you get some mild patches, their beautiful flowers will come out. You've got a few mild days in amongst all the freezing cold ones. So they're good for the winter as well as the spring. These are Geoff's own wallflowers, which are very, very good. Just look at the roots on those. They're superb plants. I can't guarantee you're going to find these everywhere you go. The local garden centre was able to offer them fresh out of the ground, which is quite unusual. So be careful what sort of quality you buy. These were about 50p for a dozen. And if you do have a nice little local garden centre that will dig them fresh, then I'd go and make friends with them as soon as you can. The other thing about planting spring bedding is make sure you put it where you can see it from the house. Go inside and think, if I'm in the kitchen or the dining room, where do I want to see my splash of colour? And then you'll get the most out of it.